The 40th presidential election was held on November 7th, 1944. This election consisted of 6 parties. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, Tax Regulators, Socialist, Prohibition, and Socialist Labor parties. For the 4th time, the Democratic Party chose President Franklin D. Roosevelt as their presidential nominee, and Missouri Senator Harry S. Truman as their vice presidential nominee. The Republican Party chose New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey as their presidential nominee, and Ohio Governor John W. Brickner as their vice presidential nominee. Dewey campaigned against the New Deal and wanted a smaller federal government. To try to cover up his declining physical health, Roosevelt campaigned across the country through an open-roof car. Even the media was on the side of Roosevelt. Roosevelt added humor to his speeches to make himself more likable. Dewey thought that Roosevelt was corrupt, but victories within the Second World War made Roosevelt very popular. In the end, Roosevelt was elected for a 4th time. He won 53.39% of the popular vote and 81.36% of the electoral vote. This election was a bit polarizing due to Dewey attacking Roosevelt's faults, but Roosevelt campaigned on his successes. The 41st election was held on November 2nd, 1948. This election consisted of 9 parties and 1 coalition party. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, States' Rights, Progressive, American Labor, Socialist, Prohibition, Socialist Labor, and Socialist Workers' parties. The coalition party was the Progressive American Labor Party. After Roosevelt's death during his presidency, Harry Truman stepped up to be the acting president. The Democratic Party chose acting president Harry S. Truman as their presidential nominee, and Kentucky Senator Alban W. Barkley as their vice presidential nominee. The Republican Party again chose New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey as their presidential nominee, and California Governor Earl Warren as their vice presidential nominee. The States' Rights Party chose South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond as their presidential nominee, and Mississippi Governor Fielding L. Wright as their vice presidential nominee. With Truman being very unpopular, Dewey decided to avoid controversial issues to remain the favorite. With avoiding controversial issues, people didn't really know where Dewey stood. Truman focused his campaign on workers, farmers, African Americans, and consumers. Truman criticized Dewey and the Republican Congress for not being specific enough on their issues. He stated that Republicans would cause another Great Depression. He stated that Republicans were corrupt and only cared about big business. As Truman continued to bash the Republican Party, Dewey barely even used Truman's name during his campaign. As Dewey campaigned for increasing government spending, congressional Republicans were unhappy with his policy, as it went against their ideas. Truman took advantage of this by trying to provoke Congress into siding against Dewey. Congress fell for Truman's tricks and ended up passing a little legislation, which Truman could then use to say that Republicans were unproductive. While people around him didn't think he would win, Truman himself was confident that he would. Truman predicted that he would win 64.03% of the electoral vote. People were so confident that Dewey would win that newspapers were printing articles in advance about a Dewey victory. But Truman was able to pull off an upset victory. He won 49.55% of the popular vote and 57.06% of the electoral college. That's 8% less than what Truman predicted, but it was a victory nonetheless. This election was polarizing due to Truman making his entire campaign an anti-Republican campaign. I would say this would be the beginning where you see people attack the other for being part of a party rather than for who they are. The 42nd presidential election was held on November 4th, 1952. This election consisted of 8 parties. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Progressive, Prohibition, Socialist Labor, Socialist, Constitution, and Socialist Workers' parties. The Republican Party chose Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, Dwight D. Eisenhower, as their presidential nominee, and California Senator Richard Nixon as their vice presidential nominee. The Democratic Party chose Illinois Governor Aldi Stevenson as their presidential nominee, and Alabama Senator John Sparkman as their vice presidential nominee. Eisenhower spent his campaign attempting to appeal to women. He did this by focusing on issues like education, inflation, and ending the Korean War. He even hired a lot of women to help him campaign. Eisenhower thought that Truman was weak on communism. This would be the first election during the long and ugly Cold War. He stated that Soviet spies had made their way into the Truman administration. He states that Truman did not properly prepare the United States military for the Korean War. Stevenson campaigned in a split Republican Party. On one side was the descendant of former President Taft, trying to keep the Republican tradition, while Eisenhower wanted to modernize the Republican Party. Stevenson states that he thought that Republicans were being too reckless with investigating politicians for having communist ties. He criticized so-called right-wing Republicans for being too harsh on American politicians, not hard enough on the Soviet Union. Stevenson was criticized for calling someone innocent when they had evidence that they were communist. To unite the Republican Party, Eisenhower endorsed many traditional Republicans during their state and local elections. Eisenhower was popular for his role as a general during World War II. Stevenson focused on the younger generations, as Nixon was criticized for accepting over $18,000 in gifts. Nixon responded with a 30-minute speech stating that he was innocent. At one point, he stated that he was given a dog which he would not get rid of because his daughter loved it. This ended up saving Nixon's career, for now, and he became a well-liked figure amongst the Republican Party. This was the first election where television ads were used. In the end, Eisenhower won the election. He won 55.18% of the popular vote and 83.25% of the electoral vote. This was the best electoral vote performance since 1940. This election was very polarizing, with Democrats criticizing Republicans for being right-wing and Republicans criticizing Democrats for being soft on communism. The 43rd presidential election was held on November 6, 1956. This election consisted of 9 parties. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, States' Rights, Socialist Labor, Prohibition, Socialist Workers, Socialist, American Third, and Christian Nationalist parties. The Republican Party chose President Dwight D. Eisenhower as their presidential nominee, and Vice President Richard Nixon as their vice presidential nominee. Former Illinois Governor Aldi Stevenson and his running mate, Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver, won the Democratic primary election with 52.3% of the vote. This time, Stevenson focused his campaign more on women. Television ads also made it easier for Eisenhower to campaign as he was getting old. For being 66 years old, he could run more ads to replace the need to make more speeches. Stevenson wanted to raise government spending and create peace deals with the Soviet Union to stop the arms race and end nuclear testing on both sides. He also wanted to end the draft system. While Eisenhower publicly disagreed with these policies, he was secretly trying to ban nuclear testing between the United States and Soviet Union. Eisenhower was still popular for being a general during World War II. Although Eisenhower was not able to help the rebels in Hungary from being freed from the Soviet Union's control, he was able to persuade the United Nations into withdrawing from their invasion of the Suez Canal. Eisenhower supported the ending of segregation. Stephen disapproved. In the end, Eisenhower ended up winning re-election. He won 57.37% of the popular vote and 86.06% of the electoral vote. This was the best electoral vote performance since 1936. This election was still very popular due to both sides running the same campaigns they did last time. The 44th presidential election was held on November 8th, 1960. This election consisted of 8 parties and 1 independent. These parties consisted of the Democratic, Republican, Socialist Labor, Prohibition, States' Rights, Socialist Workers, Constitution, and Conservative parties. Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy and his running mate, Texas Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, won the Democratic primary. The Republican Party chose Vice President Richard Nixon as their presidential nominee, and U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Henry Cabell Lodge Jr. as their vice presidential nominee. Harry F. Byrd ran as an independent candidate. This was the first election to be fully dominated by the Cold War. Kennedy criticized Eisenhower for letting the Soviet Union's economy take over America's economy. He also stated that Republicans weren't trying hard enough during the space race. Nixon stated that he would continue the peace negotiations he had while serving as vice president. Even though Nixon was only 4 years older than Kennedy, he stated that Kennedy was too young to handle the Cold War. Kennedy campaigned on his youthfulness, stating that he was a person of change. In an interview, Eisenhower joked about Nixon not having any set ideas, but Democrats were able to take that voice clip and use it against Nixon. Nixon campaigned in all 50 states, but that backfired because he spent a lot of time campaigning in states he was guaranteed to win, rather than in swing states that he should campaign in constantly. Although Kennedy was Catholic, he made it clear that he was running for the Democratic Party and not the Catholic Church. When Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested during a sit-in, Eisenhower and Nixon refused to pardon him because he was under state jurisdiction. But Kennedy made a number of calls to local politicians in an attempt to get him freed. His attempts worked, and Kennedy became the favorite amongst civil rights supporters. He also became very popular amongst the African American community. Kennedy criticized Eisenhower for not developing enough nuclear missiles to keep up with the Soviet Union. For the first time ever, both candidates participated in televised debates. They had 4 debates and had an average viewership of about 63.1 million viewers. During the debates, Kennedy seemed refreshed, while Nixon looked tired from his 50-state campaign. In the end, Kennedy won the election. He won 49.72% of the popular vote and 56.42% of the electoral vote. This election was polarizing due to both parties stating that the other side wasn't good enough to handle foreign and domestic policy. The 45th presidential election was held on November 3, 1964. This election consisted of 7 political parties. These parties consisted of the Democratic, Republican, Socialist Labor, Socialist Workers, Prohibition, States' Rights, and Constitution parties. As Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson stepped up to be acting president. The Democratic Party chose Lyndon B. Johnson as their presidential nominee, and Minnesota Governor Hubert Humphrey as their vice presidential nominee. Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater and his running mate, New York Representative William E. Miller, won the Republican primary election. They ended up winning 51% of the vote. Goldwater struggled to win over moderates by opposing the Civil Rights Act. This helped LBJ win over the African American vote. Goldwater opposed Social Security and was not very popular amongst the Republican Party. When an article was released saying that Goldwater was not emotionally stable to be president, he sued the article for about $74,000. Both Eisenhower and Nixon did not endorse Goldwater, but a Hollywood actor named Ronald Reagan publicly stated his support for Goldwater. Although Goldwater had no ties to the KKK, he was endorsed by members of the white supremacist group. LBJ took advantage of this to smear Goldwater's image. In the end, LBJ won the election. He won 61.05% of the popular vote and 90.33% of the electoral vote. This was the best performance in the popular vote since 1820 and since 1836 for the electoral vote. This election was a bit less polarizing due to Goldwater being unpopular, but polarizing nonetheless. The 46th presidential election was held on November 5, 1968. This election consisted of 3 parties. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, and American Independent parties. Although actor Ronald Reagan won the Republican primary election, the Republican Party ended up choosing former Vice President Richard Nixon as their presidential nominee, and Maryland Governor Spiro Agnew as their vice presidential nominee. The Democratic nomination was chaotic this election cycle. LBJ originally was going to run for re-election but ended up dropping out due to the Vietnam War. This ends up causing the Democrats to have to pick someone new. Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy became the only Johnson opposition and was set to become the Democratic nominee. But then JFK's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, joined the race and became the favorite. On June 5, 1968, while giving a speech about his victory in the California Democratic primary, Kennedy was assassinated. It is said that if Kennedy lived, he would have won the primary. As the nomination process began, anti-Vietnam War riots took place outside the DNC. While the riots went down, Eugene McCarthy ended up winning the Democratic primary, but the Democratic Party instead chose Vice President Hubert Humphrey as their presidential nominee, and Maine Senator Edmund Muskie as their vice presidential nominee. The American Independence Party chose former Alabama Governor George Wallace as their presidential nominee, and former Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force Curtis LeMay as their vice presidential nominee. Nixon adopted the Southern strategy, where Republicans would try to appeal to the Southern states. Wallace tried to gain more ground in Republican states by supporting civil rights. When riots broke out due to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Nixon adopted a law and order campaign. He also stated that he wanted to lower taxes for African Americans. Nixon stated that he would make the Supreme Court more conservative. He also supported the ending of the draft system. Humphrey wanted to expand the Great Society program started under LBJ. He was also hesitant in criticizing the Vietnam War. Humphrey requested there to be a debate, but none were held. Polls had Nixon winning the election with 41.2% of the popular vote, and Humphrey with 38.2%. In the end, Nixon won the election. He won 43.42% of the popular vote and 55.95% of the electoral vote. The polls underestimated Nixon by 2.22%. This election was polarizing due to both civil rights and the Vietnam War. The 47th presidential election was held on November 7, 1972. This election consisted of 7 political parties. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, American, Independent, Socialist Workers, People's, Socialist Labor, and Libertarian parties. President Richard Nixon and his running mate, Vice President Spiro Agnew, won the Republican primary election with 86.9% of the vote. South Dakota Senator George McGovern and his running mate, U.S. Ambassador to France, Sergeant Shiver, won the Democratic primary election with 25.8% of the vote. McGovern wanted to end the Vietnam War and create a minimum wage. Many Democrats and Republicans thought his foreign policy was too extreme. Republicans campaigned on McGovern as a radical leftist. Without Nixon being able to end the Vietnam War, McGovern lost his main policy and Nixon became very popular. There were no debates during this election cycle. The polls had Nixon winning with 47% of the popular vote and McGovern with 33.4%. In the end, Nixon won re-election. He won 60.67% of the popular vote and 96.65% of the electoral vote. This was the best performance in the popular vote since 1964 and since 1936 in the electoral vote. The polls underestimated Nixon by 13.67%. These times were still polarizing, though, due to civil rights issues. The 48th presidential election was held on November 2nd, 1976. This election consisted of 9 political parties. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, American Independent, American, Socialist Workers, Communist, People's, and U.S. Labor parties. Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter and his running mate, Minnesota Senator Walter Mondale, won the Democratic primaries. They won with 39.67% of the vote. As Nixon was caught spying on the Democratic Party, he and his vice president resigned. Gerald Ford stepped up to become acting president. California Governor Ronald Reagan ended up winning the Republican primary, but the Republican Party went on to choose acting President Gerald Ford as their presidential nominee and Kansas Senator Bob Dole as their vice presidential nominee. Ford was originally a well-liked president, but didn't start campaigning until October, 1 month before the election. Carter was seen as an outsider, which made him popular. After Watergate and the Vietnam War, the American people were sick of traditional politicians. Ford wanted to end price controls on gas, while Carter supported price controls. But the debates were disastrous for the Ford campaign. Ford stated that Eastern Europe was not dominated by the Soviet Union, even though everyone and their dog knew it was. And Dole was overly harsh on simple subjects during the vice presidential debates. The debates got an average viewership of 59.9 million viewers. That's a 5.1% decline from 1960. Polls showed that Ford was on track to win the election with 46.8% of the vote, and Carter at 42%. In the end, Carter pulled an upset victory. He won 50.08% of the popular vote and 55.2% of the Electoral College. The polls underestimated Carter by 8.08%. That means this time around, the polls were 5.86% less accurate than in 1972. This election was polarizing due to Nixon being found spying on the Democratic Party. So what can we learn from this era? More and more politicians want to expand the size of the government while also calling each other radicals. So it's an early rendition of the polarization that we see today.